"She's my wife now, Charlotte. You need to leave." That's what my father said. Not during a fight, not in anger, just calmly, like it was nothing to erase his own daughter just to please the woman he married 8 months ago. I didn't cry. I just left. And 8 years later, I walked back into his life as the woman who owned everything he'd lost. My name's Charlotte Blackwood. I was the daughter of a hotel tycoon. Now I'm the woman who bought back everything they took from me without a single scream. After my mom died, it was just me and Dad. He wasn't perfect, but we had a rhythm. Sushi dinners every Thursday. Sunday drives through the mountains. Quiet understanding when grief hit us both at unexpected moments. The house felt empty without Mom's laughter, but we filled it with small traditions. Dad would read the financial news aloud over breakfast. I'd correct his pronunciation of French hotel names. He'd laugh and ruffle my hair. "You're going to run this empire someday, kiddo," he'd say. Better than I ever could. Then Isabel appeared, younger than Mom had been when she died. Beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that made everyone feel slightly beneath her. Perfect teeth. Perfect posture. Perfect at making you forget she'd only known you for 5 minutes. Dad met her at the Blackwood Foundation charity auction. She'd bid on a weekend at our flagship resort in Napa. Lost the bid, but won something bigger, my father's attention. 3 months later, she moved in. 6 months after that, she married him. I should have seen it coming. The way she'd touch his arm during conversations. How she'd redirect his attention whenever he talked about Mom or me. The subtle way she'd rearrange Mom's things while Dad was at work. "It's time for a fresh start," she'd say with that practiced smile. We can't live in the past forever. But I wasn't the past, I was his daughter. Isabel didn't waste time making space, she made it clear I was in the way. First, it was small things. Mom's portrait in the living room disappeared one Tuesday while I was at school. When I asked, Isabel said it had been relocated to a more appropriate space. I found it later face down in the storage room gathering dust. Her perfume collection vanished from the master bathroom. The reading chair where Mom used to curl up with her books was suddenly too worn and needed replacing. Then Isabel began redecorating, starting with erasing every trace of my mother. The wallpaper Mom had chosen soft blue with tiny white flowers was stripped and replaced with stark gray. The garden she'd lovingly tended was redesigned by professionals who didn't understand that the roses weren't just plants, but memories. Your mother had interesting taste, Isabel would say when Dad wasn't around. But it's time for something more sophisticated. More sophisticated meant more like Isabel. Cold, calculated, empty. But the house changes were nothing compared to what she did to my relationship with Dad. She whispered poison in careful doses. "Charlotte seems unstable lately. She's having trouble adjusting. She needs distance to process her grief properly. She's clinging to the past in an unhealthy way." Each comment was delivered with concern wrapped in false compassion. She'd touch Dad's shoulder as she spoke, her voice soft with manufactured worry, and my father listened. Slowly, I watched him pull away. Our Thursday dinners became occasional. Sunday drives stopped entirely. When I tried to talk to him about business, he'd smile distantly and suggest I focus on my studies instead. "You're too young to worry about these things," he'd say. But I'd been worrying about these things since I was 12. He'd taught me to worry about them. The breaking point came when I was 17. Isabel had been dropping hints about elite European education and the benefits of boarding school. I'd ignored them, assuming Dad would never send me away. I was wrong. The Institut La Rosie in Switzerland has an opening, she announced over dinner one evening. It's a wonderful opportunity for Charlotte to experience international culture. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to laugh, to say something about how ridiculous it was to ship his daughter across the world. Instead, he nodded slowly. "It might be good for you," he said without meeting my eyes. "A fresh start." "I don't want a fresh start," I said. "I want to stay here. This is my home." Isabel's smile tightened. "Sometimes what we want isn't what's best for us. This isn't your decision." I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "Actually," Dad said quietly, "it is. We've already submitted the application." That night I lay awake listening to them argue through the thin walls. Isabel's voice was sharp-cutting. "She's manipulative, Richard. Can't you see that she's using guilt about Catherine to control you?" Mom's name was Catherine. Hearing it from Isabel's mouth felt like blasphemy. "She's my daughter," Dad said, but his voice was tired. "And I'm your wife. She needs to accept that and move on. The boarding school will help her do that." "Maybe you're right." 3 words that changed everything. The next morning, Dad knocked on my door. When he entered, his face was empty of emotion. "The plane tickets are booked," he said. "You leave next week." "Dad, please." "She's my wife now, Charlotte. You need to leave." The words hit like physical blows, not shouted, not angry, just final. I stared at him, searching for any trace of the father who used to call me kiddo, who used to say I'd run the empire someday. He was gone. I packed that night. 1 suitcase, Mom's watch, the business textbooks Dad had given me for my 16th birthday. I didn't take money from his account. I didn't take anything that belonged to him, but I took something they'd never expected. I took notes, every business contact Dad had mentioned, every deal he'd celebrated or mourned, every partner, competitor, and supplier in the Blackwood network. I'd been listening for years, and now I'd use what I'd learned. I never got on that plane to Switzerland. Instead, I disappeared into the city with $300 and a plan that would take 8 years to execute. I worked nights cleaning offices in downtown financial buildings, slept on couches of college friends whose parents didn't ask too many questions, ate instant noodles and learned to make $20 last a week. During the day I studied, not in classrooms I couldn't afford tuition. But the financial district was full of free seminars, public lectures, and networking events, where a well-dressed 17-year-old could blend in if she was confident enough. I learned about leverage, risk assessment, market psychology, how to read between the lines of financial statements. More importantly, I learned how to be invisible. By 19, I was working as a junior analyst at a small investment firm. By 21, I'd saved enough to enroll in night classes for a business degree. By 23, I'd earned my Series 7 license and started managing other people's money. By 25, I owned my own investment firm. Blackwood Capital, though no one knew the name, wasn't coincidental. I specialized in distressed luxury properties. Hotels, resorts, restaurants that were hemorrhaging money and desperately needed buyers. I was very good at it, partly because I understood the hospitality industry from growing up in it, but mostly because I was patient in ways my competitors weren't. I didn't need quick returns. I didn't need flashy victories. I needed control. One by one, I bought up struggling resorts, small chains that had once partnered with Blackwood Resorts, hotels Dad had helped design or finance in the early days of his empire. I used shell companies, offshore trusts, layers of legal entities that made it impossible to trace the money back to me. The sellers never knew who was really behind the purchases. They just knew someone was willing to pay cash close quickly and ask very few questions. By my 30th birthday, I controlled 17 luxury properties across 3 states, and I was just getting started. The hospitality industry is surprisingly small when you get to the top levels. Everyone knows everyone. Information travels fast when you know how to listen. which is how I learned that Blackwood Resorts was in trouble. Bad investments in overseas markets. Overspending on Isabel's pet projects, including the floating resort concept that had been her vision for the future. The floating resorts were a disaster. Engineering problems. Environmental lawsuits. Cost overruns that would have been comedy if they weren't destroying the company Dad had spent 30 years building. By the time I walked back into his life, Blackwood Resorts was bleeding millions every quarter. They needed help, desperately, and someone had offered to buy them out quietly through intermediaries with enough cash to solve all their problems. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, the same day we used to have sushi dinners. I'd been planning this moment for 8 years, but my hands still shook as I straightened my suit jacket outside the conference room door. The boardroom looked exactly as I remembered. Dark wood paneling. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The long table where Dad had once let me sit during important meetings, whispering explanations of complex deals. I walked in exactly 15 minutes late, long enough for everyone to be seated and anxious. Not long enough to seem disrespectful. Dad sat at the head of the table looking older than his 58 years. Gray at his temples. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when I left. Isabel sat to his right, perfectly composed in designer clothes that probably cost more than I'd made in my first year of exile. 6 board members filled the remaining seats. Men and women I'd known since childhood, who'd attended my mother's funeral and my high school graduation. None of them recognized me. Ladies and gentlemen. The lawyer at the foot of the table began, "I'd like to introduce the representative of the investment group that's made the acquisition offer." Dad glanced up as I took my seat. His face went white. "Charlotte," he breathed. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Isabel's perfectly composed mask cracked. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the calculation behind her eyes. I smiled. The same polite smile I'd learned from watching her all those years ago. "Hello, Dad, Isabel." Silence filled the room like smoke. "I'm here representing Meridian Holdings." I continued placing a leather portfolio on the table. "The company that's offered to acquire Blackwood Resorts." More silence. Then Dad found his voice. "Charlotte, what? How?" 8 years is a long time," I said. "I've been busy." One of the board members, Harrison, who'd been Dad's friend since college, cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, but we weren't aware of any personal connection between the parties." "There isn't one," I said calmly. "This is purely business." I opened the portfolio and slid copies of the offer across the table. Meridian Holdings is prepared to purchase 100% of Blackwood Resorts' outstanding shares at $47 per share. Cash transaction. Closing within 30 days. $47 was exactly $3 above market price. Fair but not generous. The kind of offer you make when you know the seller is desperate. Harrison scanned the documents. "This is substantial. What's the catch?" "No catch. Meridian specializes in hospitality acquisitions. We believe Blackwood Resorts has been poorly managed, but remains fundamentally sound." I didn't look at Isabel when I said it, but I heard her sharp intake of breath. "The floating resort project will be discontinued immediately." I continued. "Several properties will be sold. Management will be restructured." "What about existing executives?" another board member asked. I finally looked directly at Isabel. "That depends on their performance record." Dad hadn't spoken since my name. He sat frozen, staring at me like I was a ghost, which in a way I was. "I need to speak with Charlotte privately," he said suddenly. "I'm afraid that's not possible," I replied. "I'm here in a professional capacity only. Any questions about the offer should go through our legal team." I stood gathering my papers. You have 72 hours to consider the proposal. After that, we'll pursue other opportunities. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Dad, the floating resorts were always a terrible idea. Mom would have told you that if you'd asked. 3 days later, they accepted the offer. They didn't have a choice.